previously on British muzzleloaders. In Part 1, we examined the action at Cacabelos and conducted some basic shooting practices in order to establish the capabilities of the Baker rifle in field conditions.
3, 4, 5.
And of course, introduced the full-size General Colbert.
And the other one right there, just outside.
So, with shooting at 100 and 200 yards, seemingly showing that some form of accuracy was possible, my mind was such that we needed to push things to the point of failure. The next logical step was to increase the range to 300 yards, the man on his horse appearing even smaller against the woodline. Just like the 200-yard practice, it began with a 100-yard dash. Or, well, it was as fast as I could really run with all the kit on. Here again, the prone position was used to start. As you can see, the friction resulting from the firing in field conditions was most prevalent here. It always takes just that much more time to adopt a correct position and begin the aiming process. I can't emphasize enough the awkwardness of loading whilst on the ground. The patched ball cartridge is no Enfield cartridge, and while it might appear that its function would be somewhat pedestrian, it is not. The mess of grease and the ball sewn into its patch makes for a somewhat sloppy and fiddly construct. Bite too deep on the paper, and you might separate the patch from the ball. Bite too shallow, and not enough paper will be removed, leading to even more faffing as you are forced to extricate the ball with your fingers, which then end up covered in grease, further exacerbating things. These loading evolutions seemed to take forever when I was doing them, and now, reviewing the footage, they really did. It just seemed that every single detail was magnified in time. Here, I'm trying to get all the powder out of the cartridge down the barrel, and the angle that the barrel was sitting at, combined with my lack of reach, lying on my back, just wasn't working out. And now you can see the difficulty in removing the patched ball. Nobody really knows the way Baker patched ball cartridges were made, though I can tell you right now, I wish I did, because this is one of the most painful to watch loading evolutions I think I've ever demonstrated in my life. I'm trying desperately to get the patched round ball to seat in the muzzle so I can then draw the ramrod and force it home. I mentioned earlier about the difficulty when lying down and having nothing to put the butt on. As you can see here, I had it braced to my feet yet again. On the dismount here, I narrowly avoided becoming a turtle stuck on its back. Of course, what you want to have happen after wrestling with a reloading evolution on your back is to have the rifle misfire. Not once, but twice. At this point, I was just relying on the rule of third time lucky.
Well, the first try at 300. Nicked his rein. Let's try that once more.
Now, this was at the end of a very long day, and I must admit, as I picked myself up and began to run, I was thinking of a certain Whitesnake song. After the results of the first 300-yard practice, I was a bit discouraged. The intent had been to shoot one each, prone and supine. But given the extreme difficulty in adopting the position in the moment, as it were, with all the kit and the conditions on the ground, I elected to shoot prone again to better my chances of at least showing that this was possible at 300 yards. I might also add that the supine position is not one that is conducive to rough ground. If Plunkett used it, it figures that he shot from the roadway, as the story indicates, which would have been somewhat flat and regular. As you can see here, conditions were hardly that. As it was, I couldn't see the target from the existing track and needed just a bit of elevation and a slightly different angle to do so, hence the position as selected. Interestingly enough, even with my slightly elevated position here and the angle of the barrel much better suited to the pouring of powder, there was still constant fiddling with the cartridge. After I bit the other end off to access the patched round ball, bits of paper were stuck to it that had to be removed with my fingers before I could properly seat the ball. And, with the butt placed down by my foot, it was still a bit of a pain to get the ball rammed anyway. It had been a very long day, and at that point, I had resigned myself to the somewhat indifferent results, especially at 300 yards.
Well, there we go. That was the second practice at 300 yards. And just goes to show you that sometimes there's no rhyme or reason. That first 300-yard application, as you recall, caused him to lose control of his horse. And this one, well, we've got one hole here, right in his knee. And one more, right there, went through his cuff of his sleeve and into his gut. So, I guess, although it's not a headshot, that last one had 2 hits. They were a bit low, but that stands to reason. I was actually aiming at the top of his hat because my Baker is sighted at 100 and 200. Service Bakers were sighted at 200 and 300 yards. So my sights are, I don't know what, more sort of modern plinking appropriate, I guess. Anyway, it is what it is. And in order to achieve some sort of hit at 300, I need to aim well high. And in this case, I mean, I'm one to talk about crazy hats, but this guy takes the cake.
After musing it over, I ended up returning at a later date, setting everything back up and doing some more shooting. I wanted a better picture of the probability of success at 300 yards, so I planned to shoot 10 rounds, 5 prone and 5 supine, for a more general view of the rifles and my capabilities in this scenario. I managed to eke out a couple of spots on the track where it gave just enough elevation to facilitate the supine. As you have seen and will continue to do so, there is nothing straightforward about its use on this ground. That was so awkward. But this little interlude serves to demonstrate a few things. In lying down, there are so many little adjustments that need to take place in order to make the position conducive to good shooting. The mere act of trying to align the sights with my eyeball was probably the most difficult aspect of any of these supine evolutions. Determined to try and replicate this, as you can see, I went through a number of different iterations of the supine. There are all kinds of details here that need mention, the most important of which was the fact that I didn't shoot with my foot hooked through the sling because of the proximity of the muzzle to my foot. So I reverted to what I had done before, which was simply crossing my legs and using the crook of my foot to rest the rifle in. This version of the supine afforded at least the butt to be in my armpit. As you can see here, the rifle did settle down and I was able to hold it quite still. But so awkward. It wasn't always perfect. As you can see here, the butt did tend to slip a little.
Well, there's the 10 round "Would you please die already" shoot from 300. I just had to, because the first 300 practice in the last session just didn't leave with a warm fuzzy. So, although the 10 rounds isn't perhaps historically accurate, I felt by shooting enough, we'll get an idea of the general accuracy at that range in a target that is life-size like this one. So, in first glance, it appears as though not a perfect score, but certainly one that is, I don't know, not even remarkable. But anyway, 1, would have lamed his horse. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I can't reach it, 7. Just caught his cocked hat. So, 10 rounds, 2 positions, I guess technically 7 hits on the figure. However, it appears as though only one of them would have been anything close to being lethal. And that's right dead center there. His horse, mind you, well, he'd seen better days.
So, the story has been told. We've examined the rifle and equipment that Plunkett used. And we've looked at the ground and, most importantly, shot the baker at an appropriate selection of targets and ranges. But what does it all mean? I've organized the analysis into the following: kit and equipment, the sights, the rifle's inherent accuracy, the fire position, the weather and local circumstances, and, perhaps most importantly, the ground and troop dispositions. Of all the variables that have a role to play here, kit and equipment rank with modest effect. Notwithstanding the evidence pointing towards the abandonment of the knapsacks, the overall wearing of that article and the greatcoat in the shooting evolutions influenced the outcomes in fairly subtle ways. Adopting the supine position was made quite difficult by the knapsack, as it raised the upper body and made it very difficult to hold the rifle in what was forced to be a relatively elevated position. In my previous experiments, lying on the ground with little impediment allowed for better sight lines and less fatigue. The question of whether Plunkett was wearing his personal kit remains a point of speculation. If he had not complied with the colonel's orders and kept his possessions, then we arrive at another point of speculation. Would he have taken his knapsack off before doubling forward? Again, perhaps. Stripping for action is a time-honored practice to make the personal load carried as little as possible, with a view to making movement easier. As mentioned, Napoleonic soldiers typically carried all their kit nearly all the time, especially when not in camp. I suppose that conceivably Plunkett could have seen Colbert, made his decision to have a go at him, and then removed his knapsack, with words to his comrades to the effect of, "Here, Watch this till I get back. On the surface, of course, why would he not? But taken in the context of the day, with a dynamic and fast-moving, hectic retreat taking place from well east of the bridge and town already, abandoning one's kit may not have been seen as the obvious way of doing business. At least on that day anyway. Certainly, this is a worthy discussion point. The clothing proper was essentially a moot point. A bit more restrictive due to the extra layers, but generally quite manageable. The next aspect worthy of comment is of the rifle itself. Now, in the past I have attested that Baker rifles were sighted to 200 yards, with, by deduction, a flip-up leaf for 300-yard shooting. In a moment that caused me to question my memory, and maybe even my sanity, I rediscovered the fact that they were probably sighted to 100 yards, with the leaf being for 200 yards. That said, the issue remains of the difficulty of sighting at longer ranges. Indeed, it is amplified. This diagram will illustrate. At 200 yards, sighting through the notch in the leaf, the bullets generally hit at the point of aim. But if longer ranges are called for, the point of aim must be raised above the target. In doing so, an imaginary aiming point must be chosen within best estimate, to enable the trajectory to also be raised to the intended mean point of impact. Not only is the target actually obscured by the rifle itself, but just how far to raise the point of aim is now a matter of judgment. Now, surely it can be done by a competent shooter, only it introduces much more error to the process. The longer the range, the higher the adjustment, and the less likely the rifle will hit. So, while certainly not discounting 300-yard shooting, this does speak to some of the more inflated claims found in the Plunkett zeitgeist. 400, 600, or even 800 yards. Really, could you imagine the elevation required at these ranges? Riflemen were trained to shoot at 300 yards using this technique. But, to quote the regulation, 300 yards was a range beyond which no established practice was to go. So, the rifle proper was just not set up to engage at greater ranges. The probability of even one hit, let alone two, would dramatically fall as ranges over 300 yards increased. Also factoring into the issue is the increasing effect of the rifle's inherent accuracy, or rather, lack of it. As these experiments have shown, and when taken with all those earlier efforts on the channel, the accuracy attained at 300 yards is nowhere near pinpoint. In fact, it is much more general. Groups of many feet are to be commonplace, so even if a relatively effective sight picture could be had, the rifle itself was not capable of hitting man-sized targets over 300 yards away, with any degree of certainty. If we take even plain photographic evidence, we can see the progression of the group size from 100 to 200 and on to 300 yards. Extrapolation to 400, for instance, would prove that the range would be beyond the rifle's capability. So the deduction here is that Plunkett probably shot at a range he was confident in. By the evidence humbly suggested by my shooting, 300 yards would have been too far to reliably assume the target would be hit. 200 yards, however, would appear to offer a much greater chance, and 100 yards, almost certainty. The next aspect to examine is the position used. As mentioned, the popular version of the account states that the supine position was what Plunkett adopted when he shot Colbert. Now, there are many variations to the supine position, but the one that is most often illustrated, or even demonstrated, albeit in a reenacting guise, is one where the sling is looped over the foot and the rifle held near the right side. It would seem that their version stems from a drawing in a book entitled The Rifle Manual and Firing by a J. Jones, showing a variety of positions. I have experimented with numerous variations, and from a marksmanship point of view, the supine position, with only one or two exceptions, is inferior to the prone. Far and away the most effective version is one where the rifle is rested on the leg, and the butt is held in the armpit, directly transferring the weight of the rifle through a stable base, the leg, to the ground. As we saw in the course of this presentation, so many things conspired to make shooting in any supine variation extremely difficult. The personal equipment, the anecdotal evidence indicating the apparent lack of knapsacks notwithstanding, definitely had a role to play in its effect towards achieving a comfortable and stable platform for the rifle. With so many of these variations, nearly all the fundamentals of a proper fire position are absent. Often, muscle, not bone, needs to be relied on to support the rifle, leading to undue fatigue and trembling. The angles can be very difficult, leading to excessive effort and strain, and therefore instability in attempting to ensure a correct sight picture. And unless the shooter is very short, the length of the rifle and subsequent clearance of the feet can be an issue, leading to the butt held completely unsupported by the shoulder. A complete and total failure in achieving the goal of a stable position with correct natural alignment. If the sling is to be looped around the foot, it requires specific and finite adjustment. Too long and the foot protrudes forward of the muzzle. Too short and the foot cannot be placed inside it. While this aspect does not discount the use of this position, it does serve to illustrate that the sling would need to be specifically adjusted to accommodate this position. As it was, I relied on a modified style of the supine position, using the foot as a rest, which allowed the butt to be placed in the shoulder. As mentioned, it was primarily due to the slope of the firing point and its relation to the elevation of the target more than anything. As we saw too, reloading from the supine position, encumbered by kit, was awkward in the extreme. Having loaded all of the follow-on shots this way, however, should not discount the possibility that Plunkett stood up to load, that method being infinitely easier to accomplish. When considering all the options available generally, the prone position, perhaps even supported by the regimental cap, would have been far more forgiving in the majority of circumstances. Shown here, taken from another video, even in near-perfect conditions, adopting and firing from the prone whilst wearing all the kit is still a relatively laborious undertaking. However successful the result. So, did the position used directly affect the range shot at? By my experiments, I'd say, somewhat. When you compare, say, the aforementioned foot in sling method with the version practiced by some target shooters, there is no contrast. In a thigh-supported example, the leg is laid flat and the rifle atop. There is no muscle used to support the rifle, and given proper contact between butt and shoulder, or armpit as the case may be, a very stable position can be had. With the foot in sling method, the feet together, one on top of the other, and the arm pulling back on the rifle, creates undue tension and misdirected effort, leading to fatigue. Not to mention the fact that the head has to be craned and held by the neck muscles, further leading to the overall uncomfortable position. Any rifleman attempting to achieve the best possible success in hitting his target would have used a position that afforded the most comfort and stability. In order for the supine position to reflect this, near perfect conditions of ground and lack of personal encumbrance are key. I'm not so sure that these conditions were possible at Cacabelos that day. Did Plunkett shoot from his back? Perhaps. Did that afford him the best chance of success? I'd say he'd have been a fool to have picked a position that detracted from that goal. If he did use the supine position, it would have been one that afforded the most stable and consistent support. I suppose that mention should be made briefly regarding the weather. It would appear as though, despite being in the middle of winter, there was no snow, mist, rain, or fog that day. So we might assume that the weather played little or no role in governing the range of the shot. Perhaps somewhat related, however, would be the general conditions and the immediacy of the situation in the moments before Plunkett took his shot. All men would have been hungry and tired, having been marching in generally poor conditions for days, not to mention narrowly escaping French cavalry earlier in the day. Add to this the not inconsiderable effect of running before shooting, as the account states, This would have further decreased the certainty of a shot and points to a further reduction of the range. The last and arguably most important aspect to assess is the ground, specifically the locations and activities of the two sides and subsequent positions of Plunkett and Colbert. Let's first examine the French. We'll never know exactly where Colbert was, but we might be able to narrow his location down by applying a little bit of logic. He was leading his cavalry in the so-called second attempt to cross the bridge, and it appears as though, at this time, he was unmolested by close-range fire as he had been earlier. The body of cavalry would not have simply lined up, crossed the bridge, and carried on up the road, if their intent was to fight. This would necessitate a deployment once across the defile of the bridge. How many men were there? We don't know, but suffice it to say, the French hadn't been on that side of the river. Colbert was essentially unaccompanied when he was shot, and it's possible that he was in advance of his troops, for perhaps a number of reasons. Cavalry need reasonably good ground to operate freely on, and perhaps Colbert was forward to reconnoiter the ground that his men would form up on, and subsequently advance over, ensuring that it was suitable. He also may have been looking at his lines of advance, which would need to be scouted, and this could have been done whilst his troops were forming up. This would put Colbert in a semi-isolated position in front of his cavalry, and perhaps it was at this time that Plunkett chose to make his shot. Cavalry need room to deploy. The only immediately available space once across the bridge would have been beyond the gardens on the left. The wood and combination of the mill and church blocked movement to the right. With the road bending slightly at the church, perhaps Colbert had moved that distance to get a better understanding of the road's path and British dispositions. This would place him some 200 yards past the bridge and 200 to 300 yards from the British troops deployed in the skirmish line. With the French cavalry forming up and Colbert detached forward, possibly reconnoitering, Plunkett seems to have picked his moment. As for the British, if we assume that the positions as indicated are somewhat accurate, Plunkett's solitary advance would have taken him from 200 or maybe 300 yards distant, and closed the gap to where a certain shot could be had, perhaps under 200 yards away. There, lying on the ground, he settled, caught his breath, and fired the most famous shot in the history of the 95th. This examination of the ground, actually placing the troops on it, is perhaps the best piece of evidence pointing towards the range he made his shot at. Layered on top of this are the reality of the rifle's inherent accuracy, its maximum sight setting of 200 yards, Plunkett's physical activity immediately beforehand, and the immediacy of the conditions and circumstances he found himself in. These shape the overall picture, and one cannot help but arriving at the fact that Plunkett did not make his shot at 800 or 600 yards, but rather at closer to 150 or 200 yards, which, given all the contributing factors examined here, makes the shot all the more remarkable. The references for this video are primarily the regulations for the exercise of riflemen and light infantry, republished as late as 1814, and the exceptional article written by Richard Moore entitled Plunkett's Shot, a reconstruction of a famous exploit in the history of the 95th Rifles. This article is perhaps the best examination of the event and should be required reading for any enthusiast. There are other interesting and accurate examinations online as well. Other references used include The Regulations for the Rifle Corps by Ben Townsend, DeWitt Bailey's excellent book, British Military Flintlock Rifles, Surtees of the 95th by Surtees himself, Rifleman Costello also by himself, Where Duty Calls Me by William Green, and The Baker Rifle and Early Campaigns of the 95th Rifles by Stephen Summerfield and Sue Law. Thanks also must be extended to David at Research Press for providing some of the images and descriptions of the back position. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place.